Amen. Well, motherhood rolls around, and there's some unusual sides to it, and I wanted to share with you a few insights from motherhood here. The first one is this: silence is golden unless you have kids. Then silence is rather suspicious. Another one I came across: good moms let you lick the beaters. Great moms turn them off first. The next one here: licked the dark smear off my finger, then thought, phew, it's chocolate. We find one mother reflects here: some days I amaze myself, other days I put laundry in the oven. Better that than the kids. Finally, Mark Twain: my mother had a great deal of trouble with me, but I think she enjoyed it. That sounds like something my mother would say about my brother and I. But it's a tough task. It's an overwhelming task. And when you really get down to it, God has called us, as J. Vernon McGee would say, He commands us into the impossible. And when you really get down to it, it's one of these roles that we have in life that is filled with joy, it's filled with wonder, it's filled with beauty, it's filled with dirty diapers and laundry, it is filled with frustration and anguish, and it is one of the most unusual roles a person can hold because you really move in multiple directions all within about a 3-minute period of time. And that's where we find the grace of God becomes ever so important when we speak about motherhood, no matter what stage you're in. One of the things I've learned having adult children is that you never stop really being a parent. It starts, the moment you find out that you're going to have a child, and it just continues and continues. And you think, oh wow, we get them through to high school, and there's more to that, and then they move out, and then they come back. And they eat more, and you really wonder about these things. So it is an overwhelming task, but we find in the scriptures that God provides for the overwhelming need. And that's where we come to Luke chapter 9, verses 10 through 17. A famous passage tells us this. When the apostles, When the apostles returned, they gave an account to him of all they had done, and taking them with him, he withdrew by himself to a city called Bethsaida. But the crowds were aware of this and followed him, and welcoming them, he began speaking to them about the kingdom of God and curing those who had need of healing. Now the day was ending, and the 12 came and said to him, "Send the crowd away, that they may go into the surrounding villages and countryside and find lodging and get something to eat, for here we are in a desolate place." But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless perhaps we go and buy food for all these people." For there are about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." They did so, and had them all sit down. Then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed them, and he broke them, and kept giving them to the disciples to set before the people. And they all ate, and they were satisfied, and the broken pieces which they had left over were picked up, 12 baskets full. Very famous story with 3 very important parts. We have an overwhelming requirement, an overwhelming request, and then we have overwhelming grace. We start here with this overwhelming requirement. There's a large crowd, and they're a remote area. Bethsaida is actually north of the Sea of Galilee. The town itself is closer to the sea. Bethsaida literally means house of fish. So it was near the Galilean shoreline, but they're further north of this. They're in this remote spot. And it tells us here that there's this large crowd, 5,000 men, probably as many as 10,000 people were there if you include the women and the children. And Jesus had welcomed them. He wanted them to come out there. He was happy that they were following after him. In fact, that idea of welcoming somebody is to have like this warm embrace, and he was just, hey, come on, let's go for a walk, and we're going to go further and further and further away from any form of civilization. So they're down in the boonies, and what is he doing? He's preaching the word. He's sharing the good news of the kingdom. He's telling them about the gospel. He's explaining them how they need to have faith in him and repent of their sins and turn to him, and that he's going to be the cure. He's Messiah. And he is explaining this to the crowds, and people are just hanging on every word. They're enthralled by his teaching. And now all of a sudden he starts healing people. And those who couldn't see are now looking around and they're proclaiming they have sight. The lame are walking. The deaf are hearing. The mute are speaking. And I mean, they're just having a wonderful time listening and absorbing all that Jesus has for them. And we have this problem here. This overwhelming requirement. And that is, how are we going to feed all these people? What are we going to do with them? I mean, 10,000 people is double the city of Newport. I mean, imagine that for a moment. You're like out in the middle of like Island Pond or beyond Island Pond. And you got like 10,000 people hanging out there with you. And Jesus just, bring them on. I'm pretty fired up. Bring more out here. I want to talk to them and speak with them and spend some time with them. And really, when you look at this, there's this overwhelming requirement. And that's exactly what motherhood is. It has an overwhelming requirement associated with it. The idea of raising children today, right now, just the cost, from 0 to 18, we're not talking college here, $300,000. That is what there's a family think tank called Welch's, and they do studies on family cost and dynamics, and they said that $300,000 before you send them off to college. And college, could be anywhere. If you go to community college, you're talking the thousands. Go to a private school, $200,000, $300,000. That's a sizable chunk of change, and that's just one. You get 2, 3, 4 of them in the mix, and now you're talking a huge chunk of money. That's an overwhelming requirement. Time-wise, Welch's tells us the average mother with a toddler is going to spend 98 hours a week with that baby. There's 168 hours in the week, just for the record. That's like 2.5 full-time jobs. We want to talk about being overwhelmed. You're overwhelmed. You're sleep deprived when they're little, and you're just, really kind of going through life as a zombie for a couple of months until they actually get a sleep schedule going on. So they're overwhelming when they're little, and then you worry about them when they get older. They're out on their own and they don't have to, change any diapers or anything like that. But, you give them the car keys and boy, you learn how to pray. You really do. It takes on new definition once things like this happen. So they're needy creatures. They really are. From the moment they come into this world until the moment we leave, there is just a lot of need. And it's an overwhelming requirement to be a parent. And this is what we find here. The parallels between the story of the fishes and the loaves and of parenting are really quite striking. So we have this overwhelming requirement, number one. Number two, we have an overwhelming request. Jesus looks at the disciples after everybody's come following after him and said, they bring the need to Jesus' attention. He says, okay, we got all those people, you got to send them, you got to scatter them all over the place. And Jesus said, no, you fix it. What? He's the one that's welcoming the crowds, and now he tells them to go fix the problem. Now I want you to think about this. They've got 3 major deficits at hand. Number one, they have what? No food. What do they got? 5 loaves of barley and a couple little fish. That's it. No food, no money. It's not like they got some plastic they could run this thing through. And even if they did, 10,000 people, that's a lot of clams to feed them. So they have no food, no money, and I don't really think they had a place to go. I mean, it's not like you could order Domino's in the middle of Bethsaida. What are you going to do? Call up, I want 1,500 pizzas to go, please. I mean, how does this work? There's no Costco, there's no restaurants, there's no nothing. So they have no options in terms of where they could send them unless they really hike for quite a distance. And this is exactly what God wanted. He called them into this place. He welcomed them into this place. He wanted the crowds to follow after him. Why? Because God brings us into the realm of the impossible. That is how he works. He calls moms and dads to do the impossible. It has been his track record throughout all of the Bible. When does God not want people to step into the impossible? Abram, I want you to take Isaac up on the top of the mountain and sacrifice him. Moses, I want you to lead all these people out of Egypt, even though you can't put 3 coherent sentences together due to your speech impediment. Gideon, I want you to go and attack the Midianites. There's as many as the sand of the seashore. And by the way, you have too many men. Let's reduce this down to about 300. David, I want you to lead a nation of obstinate people. I want you to take on the Goliaths of this world. You have Jonah, I want you to go and preach to the Assyrians who are absolutely nuts. They're worse than the Nazis. Every time you turn around, every character in the Bible is called to do what? The impossible. To preach the good news, to love your enemies, to be merciful to those who hate you, to build disciples of the nations. Every time you open the Bible, you have this one word that's screaming out at us: impossible. And Luke tells us what is impossible with God, or man rather, is possible with God. And he wants us to see parenting as a partnership. It's a partnership between two people. It takes a man and a woman, a biological man and a biological woman, to bring into this world a child. And it takes a husband and a wife to raise that child. That's God's design. It is not the responsibility of the state to raise your kids. It is not the responsibility of the school to raise your kids. It is not the responsibility of the village to raise your kids. It is not the responsibility of the church to raise your kids. It is a mother and a father who have been called and designed by God to raise children. And it is truly an impossible task. Because when you think about it, you can have a bunch of kids that come into this world, and they don't come with instruction manuals attached to their toes. They don't. And you could have the same gene pool, the same Cheerios, the same environment, the same mom and dad saying the same things, and you could have 3 kids doing completely different things. And it's like, what's going on with this? You have one who's a tree hugger, one who's a tree climber, and the other one's burning down the tree. And you're thinking to yourself, how did this happen? They come from all the same stuff, and yet they're so very different. They're unique little people running around. And it makes the task ever so more difficult. Because just when you think, I got this phase finished and licked, they're now doing something else. And they move on. And it doesn't end. It is a task that starts the moment you realize conception has occurred, and it runs a lifetime. Now sure, there's different chapters and the like. Hopefully by the time your kid is 30, they're cutting their own food and they're able to do things. But on the same token, even though you move through different phases, it doesn't end. Because your children will still call you up, even when they're 40 and 50 years old, looking for advice. They're looking for an example. They're looking for encouragement. They're seeking out wisdom. And there's great joy. There's great joy in this task. To watch somebody grow, to develop. There's tremendous joy when you hear the first words come out of their mouth. There's great joy when they finally crawl or walk across the room. There's tremendous joy when they're able to spell something, or the dance recitals. I mean, you just see the parents, they're just brimming with joy as they're watching their little girls up there doing the ballet or playing a piano or going to the ball game, watch your kid hit a home run. I mean, there's huge joy. Your children go off and maybe they go off to college, or they head into a trade school or something. I was looking at a family shot. This has been graduation weekend, and a couple I know, their son just graduated college, and they're all just brimming with joy, and it's this wonderful, wonderful experience, especially the spiritual joys. You see your kids get baptized and they grow in the Lord. John said it very well. One of my greatest joys is to see my children walking in truth. And that exists. But on the same token, there's some of the worst horrors in this impossible task. Your child requires a surgery that could be life-threatening. When you hand a baby to a nurse in the pre-op room, and you know that you may never see that little girl or boy again. And when you get the call from the state police, you need to come down. I think this is your kid in jail. We have to talk. There's some horrifying moments. When your son or your daughter would rather talk to their friends than you. It becomes a nightmare. And this is the impossible task of being a parent. And this is what we're called to do. This overwhelming request. But we find in the passage here, and this is where it gets great, you have overwhelming grace. Jesus tells, everybody's deer in the headlight, at this point. The apostles are like, how do we get through this mess? What do we do? And, no fish, no loaves, no money, no lodging, no takeout, no anything. And Jesus says, just have everybody sit down. This is under control. Puts them in little groups. He says, bring what you have to me. And they had very little. A few loaves, a couple fish. And Jesus blesses and gives thanks, and he takes what little we have and he turns it into a lot. And that's the grace that we see on the page of Scripture. That's the grace we see in the lives of people. That Jesus takes broken people, struggling people, moms who are afraid, their nerves have been stepped on, they haven't slept in 3 days, fathers who are just beyond frustrated. And he says, what little you have, I'll give you the grace so that you could thrive and survive. In John 10:10, he said that the Son has come to give us life and life more abundant. And that God supplies for these needs on levels that go beyond anything we could imagine. He supplies us with the wisdom. He supplies us with the physical capacity. He supplies us with the love. He supplies us, think about it, sometimes we'll have a shower, somebody will bring a hand-me-down or something, or you'll go to a garage sale and you'll find just the perfect thing, but he supplies. Just as he gave the grace here to these people who were in need, that same grace is available to us today. For his power is made perfect what? In weakness. That's why his grace is always sufficient. And this is the grace that we see just bubbling off the pages of the Scriptures. And this is why I believe this passage has such pertinence to us today, because it's that same grace that we need when it comes to having a little bit of extra, the clothing we may need, or borrowing a bassinet from a friend, or being able to have a play group or something like that where you can get a little bit of a relief. That grace comes in these crazy different shapes and packages and sizes to us so that we could follow through and have what we need to raise children at no matter what age and stage of life. The wisdom that God supplies. It could be through books, it could be through a friend, it could be, it's always through the Scriptures. I'll never forget, I was the oldest, but I didn't have much of a say or play in my younger brother, who's only 3 years younger than me. We didn't have any other kids in the family. So I really wasn't a major player when it came to my brother's raising, so I never saw it really in action until I was a little older, what parenting was all about. So I was terrified, to be very honest with you, when I found out we were going to have a child. And I'll never forget, we get the news from the doctor and we're all excited about it. And one of the first things I did when we came home after realizing my wife was pregnant was I went through the entire Bible. I started in Genesis and I worked right through to Revelation. I read every single passage that had to do with parenting, to try to glean as much wisdom as I possibly could. And God supplies that wisdom. Not just through his word, but through his people, through good role models, through parents and grandparents. We had a couple down in Dallas, they lived right on the other side of the block from us. We met them in church and we didn't realize we were neighbors, and it turns out they were like 10 years older than us. They had been through everything we had gone through, and boy, they were like a treasure trove of just practical advice to help us through. And it was the grace of God that happened. To have those folk there as resources. But he also gives us the love, too. Because let's face it, there's times when kids are easy to love. They make the little macaroni mush things, and they come back with the crafts, and they cut things out of cardboard, and you're all excited about it. And then there's times, you're working on just a couple minutes of sleep, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to get through the next 15 minutes? And God gives us the love as well. He gives us the compassion, no matter how old they are. And that brings us to my closing illustration here of the story of a mother and a daughter. This took place down in South Carolina. This couple, this mom and the daughter. The mother was 88 years old, and she had a daughter who was 68. And the mom, who was 88, ended up with cancer. And she was sick, and they treated her. She went through the chemo and the little radiation, and she was doing all right. She had to have oxygen and all that, but she seemed to be bouncing back. And no sooner did she get through her bout with cancer than her daughter gets the cancer. Different type. It was a little more serious. And the daughter went through some surgeries and radiation, and she was in really rough shape, but they managed to get her home. And the mother and the daughter, they only lived a block apart. So the daughter was at home, and she had some visiting nurses coming in, and the health aides and therapists and the like to work with her and to help her through. And she was bedbound for a while. And every morning the mom would get up, and she'd hook up her oxygen tank to one of those little carts, those things on the wheels, and she'd pull it down the street with her oxygen, and she'd go to visit her daughter. And she'd spend the day with her daughter. And she would sit with her and encourage her and pray with her and just be there for her. And she was doing this for a couple of weeks, and the daughter started to get a little bit better. And they were all excited, and one day the mom wakes up, and she gets dressed up and everything. She gets her oxygen tank all hooked up, and she gets it on the cart. She's walking across the street. She goes down, and the daughter was able to get out of bed. And she was sitting there, and the home health aide comes walking in with the nurse. They're going to check in on things, and the nurse looks at the mom, and she's like, "What are you doing?" And the mom's like, "It's pretty obvious, is it not?" She's folding laundry. She had just done a couple loads of laundry. She was folding some clothes on the bed. The linens were in the washing machine. She was taking care of things around the place. And the nurse is like, man, this is what we're here for. And that old mama looks over at this nurse and says, "Sweetie, you never stop being a mama." And the grace is there, no matter what age or stage of life you're in. So this morning I want to encourage you. There's an overwhelming requirement that lies before us that lasts a lifetime. There's an overwhelming request that God puts into our lap, and He says, "You do it," but you don't do it alone, because the grace is there to be a parent, no matter how old you are. So this morning I want to wish all the moms and the grandmothers and the great-grandmothers a happy Mother's Day, and I pray that we would walk in the grace of God. Let's pray.